The city of Granada in southern Spain is a scenic tourist destination that attracts visitors from all over the world, but more than 500 years ago, it was the seat of Iberia's last Islamic dynasty, and the site of a major war which would decide the future of the peninsula. In my opinion, 3 events in 15th century Europe signify the end of the Middle Ages and the coming of the early modern period. These were the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453, the Battle of Castillon and French victory in the Hundred Years' War during the same year, and the siege of Granada in the early 1490s. In the late 15th century, while one Muslim power was rising in Europe with the Turkish conquest of the Balkans, another was at the end of its life. At the opposite side of the Mediterranean, the Emirate of Granada was fighting for its existence. By this time, Moorish ascendancy in the Iberian Peninsula was but a distant memory. The Islamic conquest of Iberia, which was conducted in large part by North African Berbers rather than true Arabs, occurred in the 8th century, and for the next few hundred years, the peninsula was dominated by Muslim rulers. Starting in the 13th century, however, the Christian kingdoms to the north had slowly but surely reduced Muslim holdings, a process now frequently known as the Reconquista. Eventually, all that remained was the Emirate of Granada in the extreme south, separated from the co-religionists in North Africa by the sea. The major Christian kingdoms of Iberia, however, did not immediately go in for the kill, as Granada was still a formidable fortress, protected by the mountains of southern Spain, while the Christian powers had become divided by internal squabbles. Southern Spain was a frontier zone, in which identities were often mixed, as in some ways, the Granadan elite were culturally more similar to their Christian Spanish counterparts than their fellow Muslims across the sea. The region was dominated by cross-border raids from either side, but eventually settled into somewhat of an equilibrium. This was all to change, with the marriage of Queen Isabella of Castile and King Fernando of Aragon. In the late 1400s, the 2 main Christian Spanish kingdoms were Castile, which dominated much of mainland Iberia, and Aragon, which was smaller but more outward-looking, already creating its own Mediterranean empire that included the islands of Sicily and Sardinia, with influence stretching as far east as Greece. With the wedding of these 2 rulers, their already powerful kingdoms were brought closer together, and Spain took a step towards unification. The Catholic monarchs, as they were called, soon set their sights on reducing the last Muslim holdout in the south, finally completing the Reconquista. Meanwhile, the Emirate of Granada had been ruled by the Nasrid dynasty since the 13th century. Its current sultan, Abu al-Hasan, was at odds with his son, Muhammad Abu Abdallah, whose name became corrupted by Spanish chroniclers to Boabdil. This lack of political unity made Granada even more vulnerable to outside attack. Moreover, Granada was isolated and could not be certain of aid from the rest of the Islamic world. The Maghrebi states were fragmented and disorganized, while the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and the Ottoman Turks were far away. For the most part, the only real assistance Granada could hope to receive was in the form of volunteers and mercenaries from North Africa. An official truce between Granada and the Spanish was established in 1478, but tensions remained high, and peace would not last long. It was Granada that struck first. On a stormy night during the winter of 1481, a Moorish raiding party stormed and sacked the frontier fortress town of Zahara. With that, the opening move was made, and war had come. The Spanish response was swift and forceful. An army, composed chiefly of light cavalry and infantry, slipped through the territory of Granada, and, taking the garrison by surprise, occupied the key fortress of Alhama. The Granadans made attempts to recapture it, but were unsuccessful. This loss sharpened the political divide within Granada, effectively splitting the emirate between Abu al-Hasan and Prince Muhammad Abu Abdallah. Fernando himself mounted an expedition to capture the town of Loja, but was opposed by the skilled Moorish general Ali al-Attar, a veteran commander then in his 80s. The Spanish army arrived near Loja, and a detachment was sent up to capture the heights overlooking the city and establish an artillery position. The main Moorish army, under Ali Attar, sortied out of Loja, and seeing this, the Spanish charged down the hill towards them, and a fierce melee erupted. At this point, a detachment of Moorish light cavalry, who were hidden on the slopes, appeared, and promptly overran the Spanish artillery. The engaged Spanish turned around, but were pursued by Ali Attar's main host. Eventually, more Spanish soldiers arrived, and the Moors withdrew, but the Spanish had suffered heavy losses in the fighting. The army then started withdrawing to the Rio Frijo, but when the rest of the army saw the soldiers on the hill retreating, they assumed they had been routed by a Moorish attack. As a result, the Spanish fell into disorder, a situation Ali Attar wasted no time in exploiting, organizing a harassing attack to add to Fernando's misery. This offensive had been a tremendous failure. Another Spanish army, commanded by the Marquis de Cadiz, Rodrigo Ponce de Leon, raided towards the important port city of Malaga, but once again, the Moors were ready for them. In the mountains, Moorish cavalry ambushed the Spaniards and routed them in a sharp engagement. At this point, the Spanish offensive had not gone well, suffering humiliating defeats and accomplishing very little. However, the tide was about to turn. Mohammed Boabdil would not be overshadowed by his father's successes, and decided to win a great victory of his own, together with the veteran captain Ali al-Attar. In spring of 1483, he launched a counter-invasion of Castilian territory. The Moorish army marched towards Lucena, intending to capture the town, while other cavalry contingents raided deeper into Castile. However, they soon encountered a relieving Spanish army. Muhammad overestimated his foe's strength and ordered a retreat, but the path was blocked by an overflowing stream. In the ensuing battle, the Moors were caught in an awkward position and got the worst of hard fighting, in which their army was routed. Ali Attar, the veteran Moorish captain then in his 80s, was killed, lending some truth to the old adage, "He who lives by the sword shall perish by the sword." Muhammad himself was wounded and cornered, but refused to surrender to Spanish foot soldiers, only to a fellow nobleman. The capture of the Moorish prince was undoubtedly a major Spanish triumph, as it allowed them to interfere directly in Granada's palace politics. Muhammad was supported by the Spanish monarchs, and eventually sent back, in exchange for ruling as a Castilian vassal. The Spanish offensive continued methodically, aiming to gradually grind down the divided Moors. In the spring of 1485, the Spanish assaulted Ronda, a heavily fortified town. The settlement resisted staunchly, but was steadily reduced by heavy Spanish cannon fire, and finally surrendered in May. Other outlying fortresses around Granada were reduced, denuding Granada itself of its defensive shield. At this point, Abu Hassan suffered a stroke, and was replaced by his brother, who now ruled as Muhammad al-Zaghal, known as the Valiant. The Spanish then drove on to the vital port city of Malaga, whose capture would further isolate Granada itself from the sea. Before they could capture Malaga, it was necessary to sever communications from the rest of the emirate by taking the town of Velez Malaga. King Fernando was involved in a minor skirmish, but his army was able to surround the fortress. A Moorish army attempted to capture the Spanish artillery train before it could get into position, but was not successful. After that, it attempted to break the Spanish siege with a night attack, but a captured messenger divulged Moorish plans. The Spanish army was ready, and in hard night fighting, repulsed this relief effort. Afterwards, The garrison of Velez soon surrendered in spring of 1487. The coastal city of Malaga was then invested. It was subject to a long siege and battered with heavy Spanish artillery, but the garrison of North African soldiers, led by Hamed el-Zagri, resisted tenaciously. During the fighting, an assassination attempt was made on the king and queen. Afterwards, the body of the assassin was hurled over the city walls. Starvation and little hope for relief forced Malaga to surrender as well in the August of 1487. In the aftermath, it was savagely sacked, and Granada lost its primary port, further isolating the capital. In June of 1488, King Fernando launched a minor raid with mixed success, but in spring of 1489, Baza was taken under siege. Though the city resisted stubbornly, it could expect no relief and finally capitulated in November. In a change from the previous sacks, its population was actually treated relatively well. With this, Muhammad al-Zaghal finally gave up, realizing his cause was lost. The conflict should have been over, but there was still one major act left to unfold. Now the sole ruler, Muhammad Boabdil, reneged on his previous agreements and turned against the Spanish. In order to defend his remaining holdings, his forces conducted raids on territories occupied by his new enemies. The Spanish army promptly laid siege to the last bastion of Moorish rule, and soon Granada itself was surrounded. The defenders launched fierce sorties, which resulted in hard fighting and heavy losses for both sides, but the Moors were clearly fighting a doomed cause. One particular event which demonstrates this was when some Spanish soldiers slipped into the city and put a copy of the Ave Maria on a mosque. Later, a Moorish champion rode out with the book attached to his horse's tail and fought a duel with a Spanish knight in which he was killed. Outside the walls, a fire devastated Fernando's and Isabella's camp, but to show their resolve, this camp was rebuilt up into the town of Santa Fe, as Granada's defenders could only watch helplessly on. During the fall of 1491, with no other option, Muhammad surrendered. A date was set for when he would hand over the city, but when there was popular Moorish outrage that their leader had given up, the date was moved forward to avoid further bloodshed. Spanish terms were initially quite lenient, as they promised religious tolerance and would allow Granadans to move to North Africa if they chafed under Spanish rule. However, this relative tolerance would not last long. This final outcome was certainly not due to a lack of Muslim resistance. Granada had fought tooth and nail against the Spanish, and the result was largely a product of Spanish artillery, numerical superiority, and determination to achieve a final victory, as well as Granada's relative political isolation. This quote, though no doubt hyperbolic, does demonstrate the situation to an extent. The Christians attacked us from all sides in a vast torrent, company after company, smiting us with zeal and resolution, like locusts in the multitude of their cavalry and weapons. Nevertheless, for a long time, we withstood their armies and killed group after group of them. As he was exiled from the city he had once ruled, Muhammad's mother herself said to her son, "You do well, my son, to cry like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." Many Spanish Muslims, including the erstwhile Sultan, fled to North Africa. To this day, there are families in Morocco who can trace their bloodline back to this Andalusian lineage. In 1492, the same year that Granada finally succumbed, the Genoese captain in service of Queen Isabella, Columbus, reached the Isle of Hispaniola in the Caribbean. Spain was full of young warriors who had fought against the Moors and who now needed an outlet. Thus, the energy of the Reconquista would be funneled into creating the world's first global empire, carving out territory in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the New World beyond the Atlantic.